This video is now in session, and we got it wrong. 538 got it wrong. A lot of the pollsters and forecasters have once again gotten this election wrong. So, time to do a prognostics, or a diagnostic as to how all of this happened and what we can do in the 2024 election. So, there are three parts to this: the polls, expectations, and the future. So, when we look at the polls from this election cycle, you'll see that in many cases, Republicans were actually leading in some of them. If you go in the Senate race, for example, in Pennsylvania, you'll find that the majority of these later polls went to Dr. Oz, albeit by 1 to 3 percentage points. In the end, though, Fetterman won by 4 percentage points. The closest poll to this kind of margin is from Marist College and Beacon Research. So that's the Pennsylvania race, although you can find that reflected across many of these races. Nevada, the same thing. You had a ton of these Adam Laxalt polls, with the exception of a B to C rated pollster, and surprisingly, Siena College and the New York Times with their poll. In the House, you found a lot of actually contentious polls in places such as Washington's 3rd District, but when it came to the fundamentals and everything else, a lot of forecasters rated this as a relatively safe seat for the Republican Party. We rated this seat as a likely towards the Republicans. We were actually considering whether to make this lean seat, just because when we looked at the polls, you had a public policy polling that only had, I believe, Joe Kent, the Republican candidate, up by 4 percentage points. But in the end, we put it as likely Republican just because of expectations, which I'll get to later. But when it comes to the polls, we probably should have expected this, because in the 2016 election, pollsters got it wrong because they underestimated MAGA Republicans, or voters who voted for Trump. And then in the 2018 election, they didn't really do any change, just because they didn't know how to change the polls in a statistically responsible way. So because of that, the 2018 election results, they got it right because a lot of those Trump Republicans didn't vote in that situation, and there was no non-response bias or even a response bias. So because of that, Democrats did well, and that's what the polls predicted. And then you had 2020, where pollsters wanted to learn from 2016, or tried to learn, but they didn't, and they still got the numbers wrong. You had an ABC Washington Post poll back in 2020 that had Biden up by safe margins in Wisconsin. And then you had 2022, the first year where pollsters really decided to try to figure out how to make polls account for this disparity. And that's how they overestimated the Republican Party, because this was a year where, even though Trump was actively engaging in many of these races, Trump himself was not on the ballot to turn out a ton of these voters. So because of that, you had an overrepresentation of Republicans in the polls, and that's how you got this kind of race where Democrats performed better than expected. That's something that we really didn't think. We thought that the polls were going to underestimate Republicans once again, especially because Trump put himself more into this race than he did in 2018. But apparently, it seems as if that the pollsters went too far in terms of their corrections from 2020, and they overshot in favor of the Republican Party, which is amazing, considering that for the past several years at this point, the polls have almost always gone too much towards the Democratic Party. So that is a change in tone, but it's something that they'll definitely have to improve from now until 2024. The other thing is expectations. For a lot of these forecasters, they knew that these polls were showing somewhat competitive races, but when it came to just historical numbers, it seemed mind-boggling that Democrats would be so close to winning a House majority, considering that the last time any incumbent party in the White House kept their majority was back in 2002, which was during George Bush's term, right after 9/11, and that event allowed people to rally around the flag and rally around George Bush. So that's how he got a Republican majority till 2004 and 2006. So that expectation there, I mean, abortion we thought was a big issue, but we first of all did not really think it would be able to be as effective as it was for as 9/11 was for the Republican Party. And then we also just underrated abortion, even though we viewed it as important. We overvalued how much voters were going to prioritize the economy over abortion, because for myself, as a young male who's never had to deal with an abortion in my family or myself, it's something that I can't really connect to. It's something that I just don't have enough ability to judge on, and that's how we really underestimated the effect of abortion. It's simply we were ignorant for this election, and that's something that we have to change when it comes to 2024. So yeah, how do pollsters like ABC, well, not ABC, but pollsters in general, how do they correct back so that 2024 can be better? And then how do forecasters become better forecasters? Well, the first thing we can do is at least as forecasters, I don't really know much about the polls, considering that that's a much more complex thing. But when it comes to us as forecasters, one thing we can do is narrow the scope of what kinds of polls that we used. So in this election, we used the Trafalgar Group for a lot of these Rust Belt races, and it wasn't that bad. I mean, Trafalgar Group wasn't too far off, but in the end, you had here like more reputable pollsters such as Siena College actually getting it right. So for the Rust Belt, we'll continue to use the Trafalgar Group, but we're gonna mix it in for the Sun Belt races with Marist College, Siena College, New York Times, and then you also, I don't know, we still have to have more conversations on the back end about this, but the Siena College, New York Times polls have been pretty accurate this election cycle. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we are thinking of just using toss-up categories for the 2024 election predictions and forecasts. And that's because when we made our prediction of Pennsylvania, that was a tilt Democratic or tilt Republican race that we rated as, which really meant that, I mean, we didn't have enough confidence to actually project this race, since even though we thought that Mehmet Oz could win, John Fetterman just had that appeal to the forgotten voters that made us really wonder as to how we would project this, and ultimately we used tilt Republican, but that really meant that we couldn't really have a confident enough prediction. But if we had to decide, then we would say it would go for Mehmet Oz. In the future, we might just do toss up and then say, we don't know really where this race could go. It could go either way. What we'll do is that during election day, we'll see the numbers and then we can project from there which side it will go. Because honestly, what's the difference between knowing one day before the election and the day of the election? As long as you know how competitive it is and what kinds of races to watch, which we identified all the three important races to watch for the Senate races, then being accurate is better for both you and I, you and me, so that we can have greater credibility and you'll be better informed as to how races will go. The other thing we have to do, and forecasters should generally do, is try to quantify a lot of these try to use local news and local stories about certain House races especially, and then try to quantify that with a way to compare that to fundraising and engagement. Because you had authors such as Michelle Goldberg that shined a light on these kinds of races, such as Washington's 3rd District, and we did read this story and we were intrigued. That's why we were considering making this race leans Republican instead of likely. But in the end, we just didn't really find an effective way to incorporate this to our methodology. And that's something that we have to change in 2024, because a lot of these stories are useful. They open us to what's happening on the ground, and in the end, people vote, not numbers, and not polls. So yeah, these stories matter much more in some ways than polls will, especially when it comes to these close races. So yeah, you had a story here from Political. We also read this actually a year ago. I don't know how I still remember this story, but I do remember the story of reading Lauren Boebert and how a lot of people in Pueblo and in Cortez were sick and tired of her. And then you also had internal polls from a lot of these local news outlets that really also shined a light on the competitiveness of these races, such as New Mexico's second district. So that's some of the things that we'll be doing, and that's some of the things that forecasters should be doing to better their forecast come 2024. So that's the end of this video. I'm not sure how many videos we're gonna do for the 2022 election, maybe one more, but after that, we're going to take a short break, and then we'll be back in the runoff elections. So I hope you enjoyed this video. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.